Hello, hello, dear watcher. Thank you for joining me again. The next part of Kyle's reading time. I'm putting out that that tweet as normal. So here that goes. That is out there. So people will know this is happening now and not in the future, like you're probably getting. So last time, last time, man, oh man, it was a crazy time last time. We lost some good people, experienced some interesting character development and unfortunate instrument breakage, which I'm just remembering something right now. And I hate to do this again like I did last week, but I've got to go get something, which are my headphones. The funny thing about seeing yourself is you can notice what you are missing. Be right back. Okay, here we are now. So I have like headphone that I can use. I can put on, and now I have the plugging ins, so I can make sure I can hear myself. Not too loud, not too quiet, just right. Man, that gain sounds like it's really high, so let's crank that down a little bit. Okay, well, I tweeted that out. We're at a good point. I've got water. I've got some Texas whiskey, that with a little bit of water, and my D20 stone, if you can hear that. Oh, that was really loud. I'm sorry. So let's break into Chapter 20, Bloody Hands into Stinging Fists. It was around noon when the wagon turned onto a new road. This one wide as a river and paved with cobbles. At first, there were only a handful of travelers and a wagon or two, but to me it seemed like a great crowd after such a long time alone. We went deeper into the city, and low buildings gave way to taller shops and inns. Trees and gardens were replaced by alleys and cart vendors. The great river of a road grew clogged and choked with the flotsam of 100 carts and pedestrians, dozens of wains and wagons, and the occasional mounted man. There was the sound of horses' hooves and people shouting, the smell of beer and sweat and garbage and tar. I wondered which city this was, and if I'd been here before. I gritted my teeth and forced myself to think of other things. Almost there, Seth raised his voice above the din. Eventually the road opened out into a market. Wagons rolled onto the cobbles, and with a sound like distant thunder. Voices bargained and fought. Somewhere in the distance a child was crying, shrill and high. We rode aimlessly for a while until he found an empty corner in front of a bookshop. Seth stopped the wagon, and I hopped out as they were... Let me get comfortable here, because I feel like I'm not comfortable and I'm being weird. Seth stopped the wagon, and I hopped out as they were stretching away the kinks from the road. Then, with a sort of silent agreement, I helped them unload the lumpy sacks from the back of the wagon and piled them to one side. A half an hour later, we were resting among the piled sacks. Seth looked at me, shading his eyes with a hand. What are you doing in town today, boy? I need lute strings, I said. Only then did I realize I didn't know where my father's lute was. I looked around wildly. It wasn't in the wagon where I'd left it, or leaning against the wall, or in the piles of squash. My stomach clenched until I spotted it underneath some loose burlap sacking. I walked over to it and picked it up with shaking hands. The old farmer grinned at me and held out a pair of the knobby squash we'd been unloading. How would your mother like it if you brought home a couple of the finest orange butter squash this side of the Eld? No, I can't, I stammered, pushing away a memory of raw fingers digging in the mud and the smell of burning hair. I mean, you've already... I trailed off, clutching my lute closer to my chest and moving a couple of steps away. He looked at me more closely, as if seeing me for the first time. Suddenly, self-conscious, I imagined how I must look, ragged and half-starved. I hugged the lute and backed farther away. The farmer's hands fell to his side and his smile faded. Ah, lad, he said softly. He set the squash down, then turned back to me and spoke with a gentle seriousness. Me and Jake here will be selling until around about sundown. If you find what you're looking for by then, you'd be welcome to come back on the farm with us. The missus and me could sure use an extra hand some days. You'd be more than welcome, wouldn't you, Jake? Jake was looking at me too, pity written across his honest face. Sure enough, Pa. She said right afore we left. She said so right afore we left. The old farmer continued to look at me with serious eyes. This is Seward Square, he said, pointing at his feet. We'll be here till dark, maybe a little after. You come back if you want to ride. His eyes turned worried. You hear me? You can come back with us. I continued to back away, step by step, not sure why I was doing it, only knowing that if I went with him, I would have to explain, would have to remember. Anything was better than opening that door. No, thank you, I stammered. You've helped so much. I'll be fine. I was jostled from behind by a man in a leather apron. Startled, I turned and ran off. I heard one of them call out behind me, but the crowd drowned them out. I ran, my heart heavy in my chest. All right, checking one more thing. Yep, I'm on the right setting. Tarbean is big enough that you cannot walk from one end to the other in a single day, not even if you avoid getting lost or accosted in the tangled web of twisting streets and dead-end alleys. It was too big, actually. It was vast, immense. Seas of people, forests of buildings, roads wide as rivers. It smelled like urine and sweat and coal smoke and tar. If I had been in my right mind, I never would have gone there. In the fullness of time, I became lost. I took a turn too early or too late, then tried to compensate by cutting through an alley like a narrow chasm between two tall buildings. It wound like a gully carved by a river that had left to find a cleaner bed. Garbage drifted up the walls and filled the cracks between buildings and the alcove doorways. After I had taken several turns, I caught the rancid smell of something dead. I turned a corner and staggered against a wall as pain stars blinded me. I felt rough hands grab hold of my arms. I opened my eyes to see an older boy. He was twice my size, with darker hair and savage eyes. The dirt that smudged his face gave him the appearance of having a beard, making his young face strangely cruel. Two other boys jerked me away from the wall. I yelped as one of them twisted my arm. The older boy smiled at the sound and ran a hand through his hair. What are you doing here, Nault? You lost? His grin broadened. I tried to pull away, but one of the boys twisted my wrist and I gasped, No. I think he's lost, Pike, the boy on my right said. The one on my left elbowed me sharply in the side of the head and the alley tilted crazily around me. Pike laughed. I'm looking for the woodworks, I muttered, slightly stunned. Pike's expression turned murderous. His hands grabbed my shoulders. Did I ask you a question? He shouted. Did I say you could talk? He slammed his forehead into my face, and I felt a sharp crack followed by an explosion of pain. Hey, Pike! The voice seemed to come from an impossible direction. A foot nudged my loot case, tipping it over. Hey, Pike, look at this! Pike looked down at the hollow thump as the loot case fell flat against the ground. What did you steal, Nault? I didn't steal it. One of the boys holding my arms laughed. Yeah, your uncle gave it to you so you could sell it to buy medicine for your sick grandma. He laughed again while I tried to blink the tears out of my eyes. I heard 3 clicks as the latches were undone. Then came the distinctive harmonic thrum as the loot was taken out of its case. Your grandma's gonna be mighty sore you lost this, Nault. Pike's voice was quiet. Telu, crush it, the boy on my right exploded. Pike, you know how much one of them's worth. Gold, Pike. Don't say Telu's name like that, said the boy on my left. What? Do not call on Telu save in the greatest need, for Telu judges every thought and deed, he recited. Telu and his great glowing penis can piss all over me if that thing isn't worth 20 talents. That means we can get at least 6 from Dyken. Do you know what you can do with that much money? You won't get a chance to do anything with it if you don't quit saying things like that. Telu watches over us, but he is vengeful. and the second boy's voice was reverent and afraid. You've been sleeping in the church again, haven't you? You get religion like I get fleas. I'll tie your arms in a knot. Your ma's a penny whore. Ooh, sorry about that plosive. Damn, that was bad. Your ma's a penny whore. Don't talk like my mom, Lynn. Iron pennies. By this time, I had managed to blink my eyes free from the tears, and I could see Pike squatting in the alley. He seemed fascinated by my loot, my beautiful loot. He had a dreamy look in his eyes as he held it, turning it over and over in his dirty hands. A slow horror was dawning on me through the haze of fear and pain. As the two voices grew louder behind me, I began to feel a hot anger inside. I tensed. I couldn't fight them, but I knew if I could get a hold of my loot and made it into a crowd, I could lose them and be safe again. But she kept humping me anyway. But she kept humping away anyway. But now she only got a halfpenny a throw. That's why your head is so soft. You're lucky you don't have a dent, so don't feel bad. That's why you get religious so easy. The first boy finished triumphantly. I felt only a tenseness on my right side. I tensed too, ready to spring. But thanks for the warning. I hear Telu likes to hide behind big clumps of horse shit, and suddenly both of my arms were free as one boy tackled the other into the wall. I sprinted the 3 steps to Pike, grabbed the loot by the neck, and pulled, but Pike was quicker than I had expected, or stronger. The loot didn't come away in my hand. It was jerked to a halt, and Pike was pulled to his feet. My frustration and anger boiled over. I let go of the loot and threw myself at Pike. I clawed madly at his face and neck, but he was a veteran of too many street fights to let me get close to anything vital. One of my fingernails tore a line of blood across his face from ear to chin. Then he was against me, pressing me back until I hit the alley wall. My head struck brick, and I would have fallen if Pike hadn't been grinding me into the crumbling wall. I gasped for breath, and only then realized I'd been screaming all the while. He smelled like old sweat and rancid oil. His hands pinned my arms to the sides as he pressed me harder into the wall. I was dimly aware that he must have dropped my loot. I gasped for breath again and flailed blindly, knocking my head against the wall again. I found my face pressed into his shoulder and bit down hard. I felt his skin break under my teeth and tasted blood. Pike screamed and jerked away from me. I drew a breath and winced at a tearing pain in my chest. Before I could move or think, Pike grabbed me again. He bludgeoned me up against the wall once, twice. My head whipsawed back and forth, caroming off the wall. Then he grabbed me by the throat, spun me around, and threw me to the ground. That's when I heard the noise, and everything seemed to stop. After my troop was murdered, there were times when I would dream of my parents, alive and singing. In my dream, their deaths had been a mistake, a misunderstanding, a new play they had been rehearsing. And for a few moments I had relief from the great blanketing grief that was constantly crushing me. I hugged them and we laughed at my foolish worry. I sang with them, and for a moment everything was wonderful. Wonderful. But I always woke up alone in the dark by the forest pool. What was I doing out here? Where were my parents? And then I would remember everything, like a wound ripping open. They were dead, and I was terribly alone. And that great weight that had been lifted for just a moment would come crushing down again. Worse than before, because I wasn't ready for it. Then I would lay on my back, staring into the dark with my chest aching and my breath coming hard, knowing deep inside that nothing ever would be right, ever again. When Pike threw me to the ground, my body was almost too numb to feel my father's loot being crushed underneath me. The sound it made was like a dying dream, and it brought that same sick, breathless ache back to my chest. I looked around and saw Pike breathing heavily and clutching his shoulder. One of the boys was kneeling on the chest of the other. They weren't wrestling anymore. Both were looking in my direction, stunned. I stared numbly at my hands, bloody where slivers of wood had pierced the skin. "Little bastard bit me," Pike said quietly, as if he couldn't quite believe what had happened. "Get off me," said the boy lying on his back. I said you shouldn't say those things. Look what happened." Pike's expression twisted and his face went a livid red. "Bit me," he shouted and swung a vicious kick at my head. I tried to get out of the way without doing any more damage to the loot. His kick caught me in the kidney and sent me sprawling into the wreckage again, splintering it even further. See what happens when you mock Telu's name? Shut up about Telu. Get off of me and grab that thing. It might still be worth something to Daikin. Look what you did! Pike continued to howl above me. A kick caught me in the side and rolled me halfway over. The edges of my vision started to darken. I almost welcomed it as a distraction. But the deeper pain was still there, untouched. I balled my bloody hands into stinging fists. These knob things seem still okay. They're silvery. I'll bet we can... Oh, then let me think about the character that this might be. These knob things still seem okay. They're silvery. I'll bet we can get something for them. Pike pulled back his foot again. I tried to put up my hands to keep it away, but my arms just twitched and Pike kicked me in the stomach. Grab that bit over there. Pike! Pike! Pike kicked me in the stomach again and I vomited weakly onto the cobblestones. You there! Stop! City Watch! A new voice shouted. A heartbeat of stillness was followed by a scuffle and flurry of pattering feet. A second later, heavy boots pounded past and faded into the distance. I remember the ache in my chest. I blacked out. I was shaken out of darkness by someone turning my pockets inside out. I tried unsuccessfully to open my eyes. I heard a voice muttering to itself, "Is this all I get for saving your life? Copper and a couple shims, drinks for an evening, worthless sod." He coughed deep in his chest and the smell of stale liquor washed over me. Screaming like that, if you hadn't sounded like a girl, I would have run all this way. I tried to say something, but it dribbled out as a groan. Well, you're alive. That's something, I suppose. I heard a grunt as he stood up. Then the heavy thumping of his boots faded away into silence. After a while, I found I could open my eyes. My vision was blurry, and my nose felt larger than the rest of my head. I prodded it delicately. Broken. Remembering what Ben had taught me, I put one hand on each side of it and twisted it sharply back into place. I clenched my teeth against a cry of pain, and my eyes filled with tears. I blinked them away and was relieved when I saw the street without the painful blurriness of a moment ago. The contents of my small sack lay next to me on the ground, a half ball of string, a small dull knife, rhetoric and logic, and the remainder of a piece of bread the farmer had given me for lunch. It seemed like forever ago. The farmer. I thought of Seth and Jake, soft bread and butter, songs while riding in a wagon. Their offer of a safe place, a new home. A sudden memory was followed by a sudden sickening panic. I looked around the alley, my head aching from the sudden movement. Sifting the garbage with my hands, I found some terribly familiar shards of wood. I stared at them mutely as the world darkened imperceptibly around me. I darted a look at the thin strip of sky visible overhead and saw it was purpling into twilight. How late was it? I hurried to gather my possessions, treating Ben's book more gently than the rest, and limped off in what I hoped was the direction of Seward Square. The last of twilight had faded from the sky by the time I found the square. A few wagons rolled sluggishly among the few straggling customers. I limped wildly from corner to corner of the square, searching madly for the old farmer who had given me a ride, searching for the sight of one of those ugly, knobby squash. When I finally found the bookstore, Seth had parked beside. I was panting and staggering. Seth and his wagon were nowhere to be seen. I sank down into the empty space their wagon had left and felt the aches and pains of dozens injuries that I had forced myself to ignore. I felt them out, one by one. I had several painful ribs, although I couldn't tell if they were broken or if the cartilage was torn. I was dizzy and nauseous when I moved my head too quickly, probably a concussion. My nose was broken, and I had more bruises and scrapes than I could conveniently count. I was also hungry. The last being the only thing I could do anything about. I took what was left of my piece of bread from earlier in the day and ate it. It wasn't enough, but it was better than nothing. I took a drink from a horse trough and was thirsty enough not to care that the water was brackish and sour. I thought of leaving, but it would take me hours of walking in my current condition. Besides, there was nothing waiting for me on the outskirts of the city except for miles upon miles of harvested farmland. No trees to keep the wind away, no wood to make a fire, no rabbits to set traps for, no roots to dig, no heather for a bed. I was so hungry my stomach was hard as a knot. Here at least, I could smell chicken cooking somewhere. I would have gone looking for the smell, but I was dizzy. My ribs hurt. Maybe tomorrow someone would give me something to eat. Right now, I was too tired. I wanted nothing more than to sleep. The cobblestones were losing the last of the sun's heat, and the wind was picking up. I moved back into the doorway of the bookshop to get out of the wind. I was almost asleep when the owner of the shop opened the door and kicked at me, telling me to shove off or he'd call the guard. I limped away as quickly as I could. After that, I found some empty crates in an alley. I curled up behind them, bruised and weary. I closed my eyes and tried not to remember what it was like to go to sleep warm and full, surrounded by people who loved you. That was the first night of nearly 3 years I spent in Tarbean. Damn, that sucks. That's rough stuff. 1 second, because I know this glass is loud and I want a drink of it. Save your ears a little bit. Just after lunchtime. Rather, it would have been after lunchtime if I'd had anything to eat. I was begging in merchant school, and so far the day had profited me 2 kicks, 1 guard, 1 mercenary, 3 shoves, 2 wagoners, 1 sailor, 1 new curse concerning an unlikely configuration, also from the sailor, and a spray of spittle from an elderly man of indeterminate occupation. And him, though I attributed it more to the laws of probability than from any human kindness. Even a blind pig found a while. I had been living in Tarmonth, and the day before I had tried my hand at stealing for the first time. It was an inauspicious beginning. I had been caught with my hand in a butcher's pocket. This had earned me such a tremendous blow to the side of the head that today I was dizzy when I tried to stand or move about quickly. Hardly encouraged by my first foray into thievery, I decided that today was a begging day. As such, it was about average. Hunger knotted my stomach, and a single shim's worth of stale bread wasn't going to help much. I was considering moving to a different street when I saw a boy run up to a younger beggar across the way. They talked excitedly for a moment, then hurried off. I followed, of course, showing a pale shadow of my former burning curiosity. Besides, anything that moved the 2 of them away from the busy street corner in the middle of the day was bound to be worth my while. Maybe the Tellons were giving out bread again, or a fruit cart had tipped over, or the guard was hanging someone. That would be worth half an hour of my time. I followed the boys through the twisting streets until I saw them turn a corner and scurry down a flight of stairs into the basement of a burned-out building. Dim spark of curiosity smothered by my common sense. Later, they reappeared, each carrying a chunk. I watched as they wandered and shoving at each other. The youngest, no more than 6, saw me looking and waved. "Still some left," he called through a mouthful of bread. "Better hurry up, though." My common sense did a rapid turnaround, and I headed cautiously downward. At the bottom of the steps were a few rotting planks, all that remained of a broken door. Inside, I could see a short hallway opening out into a dimly lit room. A young girl with hard eyes pushed past me without looking up. She clutched another piece of bread. I stepped over the broken pieces of door into the chill, damp dark. After a dozen steps, I heard a low moan that froze me where I stood. It was almost an animal sound, but my ear told me it came from a human throat. I don't know what I expected, but it was nothing like that. It was nothing like what I found. 2 ancient lamps burned fish oil, throwing dim shadows against the dark stone walls. There were 6 cots in the room, all occupied. 2 children that were hardly more than babies shared a blanket on the stone floor, and another was curled up in a pile of rags. A boy my age sat in a dark corner, his head pressed against the wall. One of the boys moved slightly on his cot, as if stirring in his sleep. But something was wrong with the movement. It was too strained, too tense. I looked closer and saw the truth. He was tied to the cot. All of them were. He strained against the ropes and made the noise I had heard in the hall. It was clearer now, a long moaning cry. "Romo!" For a moment, all I could do was think about every story I had ever heard about the Duke of Gibeah, about how he and his men had abducted and tortured people for 20 years before the church had gone in and put an end to it. What? Came a voice from the other room. The voice had an odd inflection to it, as if it wasn't really asking a question. The boy on the cot jerked against his rope. "I'll be..." A A man came through the doorway, brushing his hands on the front of his tattered robe. What? He repeated in the same not questioning tone. His voice was old and tired around the edges, but at its center was patience. Patient as a heavy stone or a mother cat with kittens, not the sort of voice I expect a Duke of Gibeah type to have. What? Hush. Tanny, I wasn't gone. Just stepped away. Now I'm here. His feet made slapping sounds against the bare stone floor. He was barefoot. I felt the tension slowly spill out of me. Whatever was going on here, it didn't seem nearly as sinister as I had originally thought. The boy stopped straining against the rope when he saw the man approaching. Yeah, he said, and tugged against the rope, restraining him. What? It was a question this time. Yeah. The old man looked around and saw me for the first time. Oh, hello. He looked back to the boy on the bed. Well, aren't you the clever one today? Tanny called me in to see we have a visitor. Tanny's face broke into a terrific grin, and he gave a harsh, honking gasp of breath. In spite of the painful sound, it was clear he was laughing. Turning to look at me, the barefoot man said, I don't recognize you. Have you been here before? I shook my head. Well, I've got some bread, only 2 days old. If you carry some water for me, you can have as much as you can eat. He looked at me. Does that sound all right? I nodded. A chair, table, and an open barrel standing near one of the doors were the only furnishing in the room aside from the cots. 4 large, round loaves were stacked on the table. He nodded too, then began to move carefully toward the chair. He walked gingerly, as if it pained him to set his feet down. After he reached the chair and sank into it, he pointed to the barrel by the doorway. Through the door, there's a pump and bucket. Don't bother to hurry. It's not a race. As he spoke, he absent-mindedly crossed his legs and began to rub one of his bare feet. Inefficient circulation, a long unused part of me thought. Increased risk of infection and considerable discomfort. Feet and legs should be raised, massaged, and swabbed in a warm infusion of willow bark, camphor, and arrowroot. Don't fill the bucket too full. I don't want you to hurt yourself or spill all over. It's wet enough down here. He eased his foot back to the floor and bent to gather up one of the tiny children who was beginning to stir restlessly on the blanket. As I filled the barrel, I snuck glances at the man. His hair was gray, but despite that and the slow, tender manner in which he walked, he wasn't very old. Perhaps 40, probably a little less. He wore a long robe, patched and mended to such a degree that I couldn't really guess at its original color or shape. Though nearly as ragged as I was, he was cleaner. Which isn't to say that he was clean exactly, just cleaner than me. It wasn't hard to be. His name was Trappist. The patched robe was the only piece of clothing he owned. He spent nearly every moment of his waking life in that dump basement caring for the hopeless people no one else would bother with. Most of them were young boys. Some, like Tanny, had to be restrained so they wouldn't hurt themselves or roll out of their beds. Others, like Jaspin, who had gone fever mad 2 years ago, had to be restrained so they wouldn't hurt others. Palsied, crippled, catatonic, spastic, Trappist tended them all with equal and unending patience. I never once heard him complain of anything, not even his bare feet, which were always swollen and must have pained him constantly. He gave his children what help he could, a bit of food when he had some to spare. To earn a little something to eat, we carried water. Scrubbed his floor, ran errands, and held the babies so they wouldn't cry. We did whatever he asked, and when there wasn't any food, we could always have a drink of water, a tired smile, and someone who looked at us as if we were human, not animals in rags. Sometimes it seemed that Trappist alone was trying to care for all the hopeless creatures in our corner of Tarbean. In return, we loved him with a silent ferocity that only animals can match. If anyone had raised a hand to Trappist, 100 howling children would have torn them to bloody scraps in the middle of the street. I stopped by his basement often those first few months. Then less and less as time went by. Trappist and Tanny were fine companions. None of us felt the need to talk much, and that suited me fine. But the other street children made me unspeakably nervous, so I visited infrequently, only when I was in desperate need of help or when I had something to share. Despite the fact that I was seldom there, it was good to know that there was one place in the city where I wouldn't be kicked at, chased, or spit on. It helped when I was out on the rooftops alone, knowing that Trappist and the basement were there. It was almost like a home you could come back to. Almost. Chapter 22. A Time for Demons. Ooh, demons. Hell yeah. I learned many things with those first months in Tarbine. I wonder if it's Tarbine. I'm talking to myself now. I wonder if it's Tarbine or Tarbian. You know, like Caribbean. I don't know. I'm just going to keep saying Tarbine. I could watch that video, I guess. I learned many things those first months in Tarbine. I learned which inns and restaurants threw away the best food and how rotten food needed to be before it made you sick to eat it. I learned that the walled complex of buildings near the docks was the Temple of Telu. The Telans sometimes gave out bread, making us say prayers before we could take our loaf. I didn't mind. It was easier than begging. Sometimes the gray-robed priest tried to get me to come into the church to say the prayers, but I'd heard rumors and ran away whenever I was asked, whether I had my loaf or no. I learned how to hide. I had a secret place atop an old tannery where three roofs met, making a shelter from the wind and rain. Ben's book I secreted away under the rafters, wrapped in canvas. I handled it only rarely, like a holy relic. It was the last solid piece of my past, and I took every precaution to keep it safe. I learned that Tarbine is vast. You cannot understand if you have not seen it yourself. It is like the ocean. I can tell you of the waves and water, but you don't begin to get an inkling of its size until you stand on the shore. You don't really understand the ocean until you are in the midst of it. Nothing but ocean on all sides, stretching away endlessly. Only then do you realize how small you are, how powerless. Part of Tarbine's vastness is the fact that it is divided into 1,000 small pieces, each with its own personality. There was Downings, Drover Court, the Wash, Middletown, Tallows, Tunning, Dockside, the Tarway, Seeming Lane. You could live your whole life in Tarbine and never know all of its parts. But for the most practical purposes, Tarbine had two pieces, Waterside and Hillside. Waterside is where people are poor. That makes them beggars, thieves, and whores. Hillside is where people are rich. That makes them solicitors, politicians, and courtesans. I had been in Tarbine for 2 months when I first thought to try my hand at begging Hillside. Winter gripped the city firmly, and the midwinter pageantry was making the streets more dangerous than usual. This was shocking to me. Every winter for the entirety of my young life, our troop had organized the midwinter pageantry for some town. Dressed in demon masks, we would terrorize them for the 7 days of high mourning, much to everyone's delight. My father played an incanus so convincing you'd think we'd conjure him. Most importantly, he could be frightening and careful at the same time. No one was ever hurt when our troop was in charge. But in Tarbine, it was different. Oh, the pieces of the pageantry were all the same. There were still men in garishly painted demon masks skulking about the city, making mischief. Incanus was out there too, in the traditional black mask, masking more serious trouble, making more serious trouble. And though I hadn't seen him, I didn't doubt that silver-masked Telu was striding around the better neighborhoods, playing his part. As I said, the pieces of the pageantry were the same. But they played out differently. For one thing, Tarbine was too big for one troop to provide enough demons. 100 troops wouldn't be enough. So rather than pay for professionals, as would be sensible and safe, the churches in Tarbine took the more profitable path of selling demon masks. Because of this, on the first day of the high mourning, 10,000 demons were set loose on the city. 10,000 amateur demons, with a license to make whatever mischief they had minds to. That sounds not good at all. This might seem like an ideal situation for a young thief to take advantage of, but really the opposite was true. The demons were always thickest waterside, and while the great majority behaved properly, fleeing at the sound of Telu's name and keeping their devilry within reasonable bounds, many did not. Things were dangerous the first few days of high mourning, and I spent most of my time simply staying out of harm's way. But as midwinter approached, things settled down. The number of demons steadily decreased as people lost their masks or tired of the game. Telu no doubt eliminated his share as well, but Silver Mask or no, he was only one man. He could hardly cover the whole of Tarbean in just 7 days. He could hardly cover the whole of Tarbean in just 7 days' time. I chose the last day of mourning for my trip hillside. Spirits are always high in Midwinter's Day, and high spirits mean good begging. Best of all, the ranks of the demons were noticeably thin, which meant it was reasonably safe to be walking the streets again. Hold on one second. Okay, let's see. Oh no, where was I? He could hardly cover the whole of Tarbean in just 7 days' time. I chose the last day of mourning for my trip hillside. Spirits are always high in the Midwinter's Day, and high spirits mean good begging. Best of all, the ranks of the demons were noticeably thinned, which meant it was reasonably safe to be walking the streets again. I set out in the early afternoon, hungry because I couldn't find any bread to steal. I remember feeling vaguely excited as I headed toward hillside. Maybe some part of me remembered what midwinter had been like with my family. Warm meals and warm beds afterwards. Maybe I had been infected by the smell of evergreen boughs. Maybe I had been infected by the smell of evergreen boughs being gathered into piles and set ablaze in a celebration of Telu's triumph. That day I learned 2 things. I learned why beggars stay waterside, and I learned that no matter what the church might tell you, midwinter is a time for demons. I emerged from an alley and was instantly struck by the difference in atmosphere between this part of the city and where I had come from. Waterside, merchants wheedled and cajoled customers, hoping to lure them into their shops. Should that fail, they were not shy about bursting into fits of bellicosity, cursing, or even openly bullying customers. Here the shop owners wrung their hands nervously. They bowed and scraped and were unfailingly polite. Voices were never raised. After the brutal reality of things waterside, it seemed to me as if I had stumbled into a formal ball. Everyone was dressed in new clothes, everyone was clean, and they all seemed to be participating in some sort of intricate social dance. But there were shadows here too. As I surveyed the streets, I spotted a pair of men lurking in the alleyway across from me. Their masks were quite good, blood red and fierce. One had a gaping mouth, and the other had a grimace of pointed white teeth. They were both wearing the traditional black hooded robes, which I approved of, so many of the demons waterside didn't bother with the proper costume. The pair of demons slipped out to follow a well-dressed young couple who were strolling idly down the street, arm in arm. The demons stalked them carefully for nearly 100 feet. Then one of them snatched the gentleman's hat and thrust it into a nearby snowdrift. The other grabbed the woman in a rough embrace and lifted her from the ground. She shrieked while the man struggled with the demon for possession of his walking stick, obviously flummoxed by the situation. Luckily, his lady maintained her composure. Tehus, Tehus, she shouted. Tehus Antoisa Eha. I don't know how to say that actual word, but that was it. At the sound of Telu's name, the 2 red-masked figures cowered, then turned and ran off down the street. Everyone cheered. One of the shopkeepers helped the gentleman retrieve his hat. I was rather surprised by the civility of it all. Apparently, even the demons were polite on the good side of town. Emboldened by what I had seen, I eyed the crowd, looking for my best prospects. I stepped up to a young woman. She wore a powder blue dress and had a wrap of white fur. Her hair was long and golden, curled artfully around her face. As I stepped forward, she looked down at me and stopped. I heard a startled intake of breath as one hand went to her mouth. Pennies, ma'am? I held up my hand and made it tremble just a little. My voice trembled too. Please? I tried to look every bit as small and hopeless as I felt. I shuffled from foot to foot in the thin gray snow. You poor dear, she sighed almost too quietly for me to hear. She fumbled with the purse at her side, either unable or unwilling to take her eyes from me. After a moment, she looked inside her purse and brought something out. As she curled my fingers around it, I felt the cold, reassuring weight of a coin. Thank you, ma'am, I said automatically. I looked down for a moment and saw silver glinting through my fingers. I opened my hand and saw a silver penny. A whole silver penny. I gaped. A silver penny was worth 10 copper pennies, or 50 iron ones. More than that, it was worth a full belly every night for half a month. For an iron penny, I could sleep on the floor at the Red Eye for the night. For two, I could sleep on the hearth by the embers of the evening fire. I could buy a rag blanket that I would hide on the rooftops, keeping me warm all winter. I looked up at the woman, who was still looking down at me with pitying eyes. She couldn't know what this meant. Lady, thank you. My voice cracked. I remembered one of the things that we said back when I lived in the troop. May all your stories be glad ones, and your roads be smooth and short. She smiled at me and might have said something, but I got a strange feeling near the base of my neck. Someone was watching me. On the street, you either develop a sensitivity to certain things, or your life is miserable and short. I looked around and saw a shopkeeper talking with a guard and gesturing in my direction. This wasn't some waterside guard. He was clean-shaven and upright. He wore a black leather jerkin with metal studs and carried a brass-bound club as long as his arm. I caught scraps of what the shopkeeper was saying. Customers, who's going to buy chocolate with her? He gestured my way again and said something I couldn't catch. Pays you? That's all right. Maybe I should mention. The guard turned his head to look in my direction. I caught his eyes. I turned and ran. I headed for the first alley I saw, my thin shoes slipping on the light layer of snow that covered the ground. I heard his heavy boots pounding behind me as I turned into a second alley branching off from the first. My breath was burning in my chest as I looked for somewhere to go, somewhere to hide. But I didn't know this part of the city. There were no piles of trash to worm into, no burned out buildings to climb through. I felt sharp frozen gravel slice through the thin sole of one of my shoes. Pain tore through my foot as I forced myself to keep running. I ran into a dead end, and after my third turning, I was halfway up one of the walls when I felt a hand close around my ankle and pull me to the ground. My head hit the cobblestones, and the world spun dizzily as the guard lifted me off the ground, holding me by one wrist in my hair. Clever boy, aren't you? He panted, his breath hot on my face. He smelled like leather and sweat. You're old enough. You should know not to run by now. He shook me angrily and twisted my hair. I cried out as the alley tilted around me. He pressed me roughly against a wall. You should know enough to becoming hillside either. You should know enough not to becoming hillside either. He shook me. You dumb boy? No, I said muzzily as I felt for the coal. No, as I muzzily. Sorry. No, I said muzzily as I felt for the cool wall with my free hand. No. My answer seemed to infuriate him. No? He bit off the word. You got me in trouble, boy. I might get written up. If you aren't dumb, then you must need a lesson. He spun me around and threw me down. I slid in the greasy alley snow. My elbow struck the ground and my arm went numb. The hand clutching a month of food, warm blankets, and dry shoe came open. Something precious flew away and landed without even a clink as it hit the ground. I hardly noticed. The air hummed before his club cracked against my leg. He snarled at me. Don't come hillside, understand? The club caught me again, this time across the shoulder blades. Everything past Fowler Street is off limits to you, little whore, son. Understand? He backhanded me across the face, and I tasted blood as my head careened off the snow-covered cobbles. I curled into a ball as he hissed down at me. And Mill Street and Mill Market is where I work, so you never come back here again. He punctuated each word with a blow from his stick. Understand? I lay there shaking in the churned-up snow, hoping it was over, hoping he would just go away. Understand? He kicked me in the stomach, and I felt something tear inside of me. I cried out and must have babbled something. He kicked me again when I didn't get up, then went away. I think I passed out or lay in a daze. When I finally came to my senses again, it was dusk. I was cold to the very center of my bones. I crawled around in the muddy snow and wet garbage, searching for the silver penny with fingers so numb, with cold they would barely work. One of my eyes was swelled shut, and I could taste blood, but I searched until the last scrap of evening's light was gone. Even after the alley had gone black as tar, I kept sifting the snow with my hands, though I knew in my heart of hearts that my fingers were too numb to feel the coin, even if I had chanced to cross it. 1 second here. I used the wall to get to my feet and started to walk. My wounded foot made progress slow. Pain stabbed up my leg with each step, and I tried to use the wall as a crutch to keep some weight off of it. I moved into Waterside, the part of the city that was more a home to me than anywhere else. My foot grew numb and wooden from the cold, and while that worried some rational piece of me, my practical side was just glad there was one less part of me that hurt. It was miles back to my secret place, and my limping progress was slow. At some point, I must have fallen. I don't remember it, but I do remember lying in the snow and realizing how delightfully comfortable it was. I felt like drawing itself over me like a thick blanket, like death. I closed my eyes. I remember the deep silence of the deserted street around me. I was too numb and tired to be properly afraid. In my delirium, I imagined death in the form of a great bird with wings of fire and shadow. It hovered above, watching patiently, waiting for me. I slept, and the great bird settled its burning wings around me. I imagined a delicious warmth. Then its claws were in me, tearing me open. No, it was just the pain of my torn ribs as someone rolled me onto my back. Blearily, I opened an eye and saw a demon standing over me. In my confused, incredulous state, the sight of the man in the demon mask startled me into wakefulness. The seductive warmth I had felt a moment ago vanished, leaving my body limp and leaden. "It is, I told you, there's a kid lying in the snow here." The demon lifted me to my feet. Now awake, I noticed his mask was sheer black. This was Incanus, Lord of Demons. He set me unsteadily onto my feet and began to brush away the snow that covered me. Through my good eye, I saw a figure in a livid green mask standing nearby. "Come on," the other demon said urgently, her voice sounding hollowly from behind the rows of pointed teeth. Incanus ignored her. "Are you okay?" I couldn't think of a response, so I concentrated on keeping my balance as the man continued to brush the snow away. With the sleeve of his dark robe. I heard the sound of distant horns. The other demon looked nervously down the road. "If we don't keep ahead of them, we'll be up to our shins in it," she hissed nervously. Incanus brushed the snow out of my hair with his dark gloved fingers, then paused and leaned in closer to look at my face. His dark mask loomed oddly in my blurry vision. "God's body, Holly. Someone's beaten the hell out of this kid. On Midwinter's Day, too." "Guard," I managed to croak. I tasted blood when I said the word. "You are freezing," Incanus said, and began to chafe my arms and legs with his hands, trying to get my blood flowing again. "You'll have to come with us." The horns sounded again, closer. They were mixed with the dim sounds of a crowd. "Don't be stupid," the other demon said. "He's in no shape to go running through the city." "He's in no shape to stay here," Incanus snapped. He continued to massage my arms and legs roughly. Some feeling was slowly returning to them, mostly a stinging, prickly heat that was like a painful mockery of the soothing warmth I had felt a minute ago when I was drifting off to sleep. Pain jabbed at me each time he went over a bruise, but my body was too tired to flinch away. The green-masked demon came close and laid a hand on our friend's shoulder. "We have to go now, Garrick. Someone else will take care of him." She tried to pull her friend away and met with no success. If they find us here with him, they'll assume we did it. The man behind the black mask swore, then nodded and began to rummage around underneath his robe. Don't lie down again, he said to me in an urgent tone, and get inside, something you can warm up. Somewhere you can warm up. The crowd sounds were close enough for me to hear individual voices mixed with the noise of horse hooves, and creaking wooden wheels. The man in the black mask held out his hand. It took me a moment to focus on what he had held. A silver talent, thicker and heavier than the penny I had lost. So much money I could hardly think of it. Go on, take it. He was a form of darkness, black hooded cloak, black mask, black gloves, and Canis stood in front of me holding out a bright bit of silver that caught the moonlight. I was reminded of the scene from Daonica, where Tarsus sells his soul. I took the talent, but my hand was so numb I couldn't feel it. I had to look down to make sure my fingers were gripping it. I imagined I could feel warmth radiating up my arm. I felt stronger. I grinned at the man in the black mask. Take my gloves too. He pulled them off and pushed them against my chest. Then the woman in the green demon mask pulled my benefactor away before I could give him any word of thanks. I watched the two of them go. Their dark robes made them look like pieces of retreating shadow against the charcoal colors of Tarabin's moonlit street. Not even a minute passed before I saw the pageantry's torchlight come around the corner toward me. The voices of 100 men and women singing and shouting crashed over me like waves. I moved away until I felt my back press up against a wall. Then I slid weakly sideways until I found a recessed doorway. I watched the pageantry from my vantage there. People poured by, shouting and laughing. Telu stood tall and proud in the back of a wagon drawn by 4 white horses. His silver mask gleamed in the torchlight. His white robes were immaculate and lined with fur at the cuff and collar. Gray-robed priests followed along beside the wagon, ringing bells and chanting. Many of them wore the heavy iron chains of penitent priests. The sound of the voices and bells, the chanting and the chains mingled to make a sort of music. All eyes were for Telu. No one saw me standing in the shadows of the doorway. It took nearly 10 minutes for all of them to pass. Only then did I emerge and begin to make my careful way home. It was slow going, but I felt fortified by the coin I held. I checked the talent every dozen steps or so to reassure myself that my numb hand was still gripping it tightly. I wanted to put on the gloves I had been given, but I feared to drop the coin and lose it in the snow. I don't know how long it took for me to get back. The walking warmed me slightly, though my feet still felt wooden and numb. When I looked back over my shoulder, my trail was marked by a smear of blood in every other footprint. It reassured me in an odd way. A foot that bleeds is better than one that is frozen solid. I stopped at the first inn I recognized, the Laughing Man. It was full of music, singing, and celebration. I avoided the front door and went around to the back alley. There were a pair of young girls chatting in the kitchen doorway, avoiding their work. I limped up to them, using the wall as a crutch. They didn't notice me until I was nearly on top of them. The younger one looked up at me and gasped. I took a step closer. Could one of you bring me food and a blanket? I can pay. I held out my hand and was frightened by how much it shook. It was smeared with blood from when I had touched the side of my face. The inside of my mouth felt raw. It hurt to talk. Please. They looked at me for a moment in stunned silence. Then they looked at each other, and the older of the two motioned the other inside. The young girl disappeared through the door without a word. The older girl, who might have been 16, came closer to me and held out her hand. I gave her the coin and let my arm fall heavily to my side. She looked at it and disappeared inside after a second-long glance at me. Through the open doorway, I heard the warm, bustling sounds of a busy inn, the low murmur of conversation, punctuated with laughter, the bright clink of bottle glass, and the dull thump of wooden tankards on tabletops. And threading gently through it all, a lute played in the background. It was faint, almost drowned by the other noise, but I heard it the same way a mother can mark her child crying from a dozen rooms away. The music was like a memory of family, of friendship and warm belonging. It made my gut twist and my teeth ache. For a moment, my hands stopped, aching from the cold, and instead longed for the familiar feel of music running through them. I took a slow, shuffling step, slowly sliding along the wall. I moved back away from the doorway until I couldn't hear the music anymore. Then I took another step, until my hands hurt with the cold again, and the ache in my chest came from nothing more than broken ribs. They were simpler pains, easier to endure. I don't know how long it was before the two girls came back. The younger one held out a blanket wrapped around me. I hugged it to my aching chest. It seemed disproportionately heavy for its size, but my arms were trembling slightly under their own weight, so it was hard to tell. The other girl held out a small, solid purse. I took it as well, clutching it so tightly my frost-burned fingers ached. She looked at me. "You can have a corner by the fire in here if you want it." The young girl nodded quickly. "Natty won't mind." She took a step and reached out to take my arm. I jerked away from her, almost falling. "No." I meant to shout it, but it came out as a weak croak. "Don't touch me." My voice was shaking, though I couldn't tell if I was angry or afraid. I staggered away against the wall. My voice was blurry in my ears. "I'll be fine." The younger girl started to cry, her hands hanging useless at her side. Hanging useless at her sides. "I've got somewhere to go." My voice cracked, and I turned away. I had hurried off as fast as I could. I wasn't sure what I was running from, unless it was people. That was another lesson I had learned perhaps too well. People meant pain. I heard a few muffled sobs behind me. It seemed a long while before I made it to the corner. I made it to my hidden place, where the roofs of two buildings met underneath the overhang of a third. I don't know how I managed to climb up there. Inside the blanket was a whole flask of spiced wine and a loaf of fresh bread nestled next to a turkey breast bigger than both my balled fists. I wrapped myself in the blanket and moved out of the wind as the snow turned to sleet. The brick of the chimney behind me was warm and wonderful. The first swallow of wine burned my mouth like fire where it was cut, but the second didn't sting nearly so much. The bread was soft and the turkey was still warm. I woke at midnight when all the bells in the city started ringing. People ran and shouted in the streets. The 7 days of high mourning were behind us. Midwinter was past. A new year had begun. All right. I'm going to call it there. Sorry, there towards the end, my voice was getting really tired. I think I bit off more than I could chew. Those were longer chapters than what I am accustomed to based off earlier parts of the book. But thank you for sticking in. Thank you for listening. Please like, subscribe below if you want to keep up with the series. I am considering adding a second day of this and doing, a little bit of a smaller book. Maybe that would be a good idea. That way I can get through some more material, provide a little bit more to listen to. I'm not trying to make this a channel thing, but, if people want to hear me read, cool. That's totally fine. If you're interested in what else I do, I run a podcast with my band, Lindby, that is called Bombarded. They all play bards. I DM it, and they bring their instruments to the table. They perform their spells. Every episode, we have dice that have chords on them, and they can roll those dice and write a song. So every episode provides you a new song from a band in a D&D world that I've created. So if you're interested in that, go to any of your podcatchers, check out Bombarded. If you want to follow that on social media, that's going to be at BombardedCast. If you want to keep up with me on social media, I'm pretty much on Twitter at this point. That's like the only thing I can handle. But it's at Boognish Theory, which that's BOOGNISH_theory. So type that in if you want to keep up with me and see what I'm doing. If you're wondering, Boognish is from a band called Ween. I highly recommend looking up anything by Ween. Well, let me rephrase that. It depends on your musical proclivities. There's a little bit of something for everybody. I recommend starting with the album Quebec or White Pepper. So Ween, Quebec, White Pepper. I love that band. Go check them out. Let me know what you think. Leave comments below. Again, like, subscribe. Thank you again, and I'll catch you next time.